Welcome, Kellogg community. I'm Michaela Doyle with the Kellogg School of Management. Thank you for joining us today for Conversations with Kellogg Leaders featuring Ole Jacob Sunde. In this webinar series, Dean Corneli speaks with Kellogg alumni leaders on timely issues and challenges facing the global business community. You can catch up on prior webinars in this series at our virtual events page on the Kellogg alumni website. We will put a link to that site into the chat now. Today's presentation will last 1 hour, and we invite you to submit questions for our speaker at any time using the Q&A icon that's located at the bottom of your screen. We will address audience questions throughout the conversation, and with that, I'm happy to welcome Dean Francesca Corneli.
Hello, everyone. It's so great to be back with another amazing conversation with Kellogg Leaders. This is a great opportunity to showcase how we have amazing alums throughout the world who have an amazing impact, amazing careers. And this morning, I'm so delighted, or evening, depending on where you are in the world, or the middle of the night. We are actually going the place where it's not morning. We are going to Norway. And I am so delighted to welcome Ole Jacob Sunde because he's really, I always say how our alums really exemplify how Kellogg education is. He's had the most varied and interesting careers from being an entrepreneur to being investors, and he's now the chairman of the Scott Trust, focusing on defending freedom of the press, ensuring the financial viability. There's so much to talk about and so interesting. So Ole Jacob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I can say that I wish my family could hear your introduction. Maybe I can get some respect from my family. So thank you very much.
Well, we will record this conversation and then we can send you that.
Okay, thank you.
You definitely deserve it. Yes. Start because as I'm saying, you had such an amazing long career. So I want to start from the very beginning because it's so interesting. Even before coming to Kellogg, you were in the US high school student, and then you worked for Procter and Gamble in South America, coming from Norway, and then attended Kellogg. And we try to talk about the importance of having different backgrounds, and that's something, if people don't have it before, they get exposed in Kellogg. But you were exposed to that. What did it mean? What it meant for you, for your career directions, having such exposures?
Well, I think that at least I have recognized over the years that we understand society based on our experiences and how we have seen different environments. And of course, for me, I was very lucky coming as a foreign exchange student to at that upstate New York, and spending a year there. Also, before I came to Kellogg, I didn't only go to Venezuela to work for Procter and Gamble, but I went to France and I studied a year in France. Then I went to Switzerland and I studied 2 years in Switzerland. So when I came to Kellogg, I guess I had experienced quite a lot of cultures and both understanding the similarities and the differences of different cultures. And to me, that gave me, first and foremost, I guess, a sense of responsibility that I wanted to give something back, and that my education was a part of that. And I guess it gave me a respect for different perspectives, and that different perspectives are so important in trying to make good decisions. And if I should sort of try to make this a part of our current society, I think that now we see the opposite. We see that people are more limited in their experiences, and that very quickly can lead to polarizations.
I love what you're saying. This is exactly why, like in a business school, we want people from such different background, international or industry and so on, because that,
Uh-huh.
right, that opens people's mind.
Hmm.
Uh, Now, I want to talk also, it's like I say, there's a lot of things. Let's set the stage. I love that, I didn't know about France and Switzerland. So obviously, it's even more varied than I thought. And then after Kellogg, you went to work at McKinsey, which is
Hmm.
not unusual for our students. But then you went back to Norway and you started as an entrepreneur. And then as
Hmm.
someone who comes from Italy, I can appreciate how new it must have been and not a kind of world that really was necessarily conducive to that. So, how did you get started and how could you thrive in a world where what you were doing was probably very unusual?
Well, I think that uh, starting a company is basically because you have an inner drive, you want to do something, change society. Um, when I came back to Norway, as a matter of fact, I didn't work in Norway after Kellogg. I went to Copenhagen because McKinsey didn't have an office in Oslo at that point in time. And I traveled around in Europe and worked mostly in Europe, not necessarily in Copenhagen or Scandinavia. But I think, as an entrepreneur, what you had to do is actually to see opportunities arise and be flexible and try to be close to clients' needs and never lose contact with your clients. So when I came back to Norway, it was much more about what are the opportunities in the Norwegian market and how could I match my background and my experience. That said, I must admit that when I look back at my first sort of feeble attempts to start a company, it is with a little astonishment, to think about the diehard conviction that I was going to succeed and the naivety that I was starting with. So, but maybe I should say now that I actually started a business when I was at Kellogg's.
Oh,
Um,
I love that.
I don't think you knew that,
No.
but it was called North Shore Tax Service, and
Oh,
like knew anything about taxes or American taxes, but somebody else. We were a team of four, two others knew. So I guess my claim to fame was when we had at some point in time a French baker that had sort of been gotten work in the Chicago area because there was a lot of need for or popular with French pastry, etc. And then he sort of walked into his office, or our offices, but he didn't know much about um, uh, taxes nor about English. But fortunately, I spoke French. So I could sort of translate his bewilderment into something that could be of help to him. So
that's a
there are many
great
ways to become an entrepreneur.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hear so much from the entrepreneurs. Sometimes this is like really an urge in them, and they find it. So I guess it was in you that passion for creating new things. If you started even when you were a
Hmm.
Kellogg student.
Yeah.
Now, so then you had a few successful deals, and then how did you grow from there? And what made you do another one, or thinking, how did you evolve your career at this stage?
Well, I think starting one company and then moving on to the next one is more, it's a little bit coincidence. My first business was quoted on the Norwegian Stock Exchange, and 1 year on the stock exchange, and we got a public offer for the company. And at that point in time, I didn't own the majority anymore, so I understood that I had to sell. But it was from ABN AMRO, the large Dutch
Yes.
bank, and I didn't fancy reporting to Amsterdam. No offense to the Dutch, but so I negotiated a deal where I purchased a small part of my previous company, and that was sort of the starting point for my next one. And I had seen that the market in Europe was moving more from finance or from private wealth accumulation to the need for advice more than just products. So in a way, I moved from the product side of the finance industry to the advisory side, sort of walking around the table and sitting next to the client and asking him or her about what do you really need? And are you sure that these products that these banks are sort of trying to sell you is the right things for you?
That's amazing, right? So, like, I love that you move from taxis, helping the bakers and various things, all the way to the finance. And so, when you started then the private bank formed you, right, to help Scandinavian people to put their wealth to work, then you became like you can't like it was still an entrepreneurial thing because it was a new thing, but it became more like an investors. How did you see the two things connected, right? Your world of more like a private equity, a venture capital into the investment. Did it help you?
I think what I didn't sort of like with the finance industry is that it was much more about um, making money or making return. It was not really focused on making your life better, making your life more meaningful. So if you take the name, I know that that doesn't mean anything in English, formula, um, but in the Scandinavian languages, comes from German, Vermogen, which actually the direct translation is more agency um, to English. So what are you able to achieve having come in the fortunate position that you own wealth? So I think to me, wealth management is much more about getting the best out of your life. And thus we also have our vision is a richer life,
Yeah.
the source to a richer life. So we should be the enabler to clients having a better life.
It's amazing as a big, I love the fact that it's a big bang, but what you had is better life for people.
Yeah, I think most entrepreneurs do have that urge to, to make life a little better for people or for society at large. Um,
Now, let me ask you, because there are already very interesting questions here. And let me ask you one. There's several, but I'll distribute. This one says, you mentioned your global perspective contributing to your purpose. How do you balance a desire to do good in the world and your desire to be a successful business person, goals that might not always be complementary, which is kind of what you were talking now, right? With the bank.
yeah, if I should expand on that, to
Yes.
me, I disagree with those being contradictory or
Mm.
being in opposition to each other. I do think that it's for a company to survive long term, it has to be in harmony with society because that's how you could maintain, in my view, the competitive advantage over time. Because people would like your brand and your product if you're able to move with society and always have that in mind, that you need a greater vision for what you're doing than just making money. At the other side, making money is, of course, important because if you can't sustain your business and be profitable, you can't invest in it and you can't reinvent yourself. You can't do product development. So it's a little bit sort of yin and yang. You need both. And I would also say that take the talent side of the business. If you say to a Kellogg student, come and work with us, we'll make you filthy rich. I mean, I don't think they will come. But if you tell them, come to us because we have some products, some services that really mean something in society that could give people a better living, they will come.
I so agree with you, and that's why I love to do this conversation because I always feel like there's this special Kellogg spirit, and what you're saying resonates so much with the students we have, right now in the classroom, right? It's a lot of years different, but same value, and the idea of a big vision, big impact. That's what's
Mm-hmm.
driving, even when you also care about the money. I love that. Thank you. Now, I have several other, actually, let me ask you one more from this question and then I'll come back to my question. It says, can you think of one or a few formative moments that helped build you into the leader you are today?
Well, I mentioned this before, but since we're now talking about Kellogg, I will never forget Professor Levengood when he in class talked about internalizing the externalities. And to me, that was more than just sort of a climate focus. It was more that what I've been talking about, you have to take all the different perspectives of society into your decision making, and then be aware of the fact that you're not living in insulation from the world, and from the trends in the world and from your responsibility to the world. So that was definitely a defining moment. We'll talk about my experience with free press, etc., and free speech afterwards, I guess. But in 1995, I came with my father, and his inmates from concentration camps in Germany, because both my parents, and he was in a concentration camp for his resistance work. And when I saw these men, they were then at my age about now, it was in 1995, the spirit that they still had, and the ability to articulate why freedom was important, that was a defining moment.
That is an amazing story. That is an amazing story. And given that you mentioned Professor Levingood, I should mention to you that our teaching award right now is the Levingood Award, exactly because so many people felt
Very good.
inspired
Very
by
good.
it. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Now, let me get to your still a bit more in the business side of private banks like Formio, right? We know everybody's looking at artificial intelligence and how it's
Mm-hmm.
transforming. How can they derive the most value from AI?
Oh, that's a big question.
Yes.
uh, I think, to be honest, I'm still scratching my head. I mean, the really tricky part is how it will influence client-facing activities. Why that is tricky is how fast will clients adapt to new service models. Will you want to entrust your savings to an avatar? And I think that will take time. It's a little bit like, do you trust self-driving cars? Well, maybe, but it has taken 10 years, and still you're a little unsure. So, and at the same time, I doesn't think that this means that you shouldn't experiment with different hybrid models. You should definitely do that. And for, I guess, incumbents, it's very important that you are able to keep the direct contact with your clients and not be pushed to the backseat by intermediaries. Because it's in that client relationship and the direct client relationship that you can actually gauge and understand how client needs are changing and how adaptable they are for new sort of ways of interacting with you as a supplier. The easy part of AI is, of course, how you could be able to increase your productivity. Either by reducing the cost or providing the same service or a better service with the same level of cost. So the difficulty in that part, I think, is that a lot of people or a lot of companies are experimenting, but fewer have been able to implement changes and actually cash in on it to have, being able to reduce cost due to AI. And that is, I think, is going to be the litmus test of how you're able to integrate and draw the benefits of artificial intelligence.
So that's so interesting. So you think there will be a part that remain, from what I understand from you, at the human level, or that in the interaction, or you think there's a possibility that it will, besides we'll all go to the AI?
Well, I think that in most industries there will be a split. I think AI will take care of some sort of first level needs, you can say, and that there will be, the service will be good enough so that it could serve more the basic purpose or the basic need that you have. But if you want to have, particularly in trust-based businesses, I do think that there is an element of, I would like human eyes on it, at least for the time being. And I think that time being is going to be probably longer than we think, because that has to do with, changing our habits. To give you one example that I think everybody could relate to, in 2005, I gave a speech saying that in 10 years, we wouldn't have printed editions of newspapers anymore. That is 20 years ago, and we still have printed edition of newspapers. and some people
forward looking though.
Yeah, but I was at least 10 years wrong,
I see. You're right.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Now, also talking about, I know that you still invest in startups. So, our alums, our students are also interested in this. What opportunities do you find most exciting?
Well, the first that come to my mind is education, and I have invested in that and still is invested in that. And that's basically because I think that the digital age has been a missed blessing to education. If you now see, I think that's the same trend in all Western Europe. Students read slower if they can read. I mean, the proficiency in reading is declining in writing, but also in sort of other basic skills like mathematics or history and geography. I mean, it's we haven't been able to use the digital age properly in improving the educational systems. And I think that we have, to some extent, moved too fast. So there are some basic skills that we are not fostering in the same way as we did before. Since you are Italian, I can tell you that I'm very fond of Montessori, Maria Montessori, and her way of running schools. And together with my wife, I've been establishing several Montessori schools, both in Norway and worldwide. And one of the basic skills here is how you at early age learn by sensing things with your hands, not not
Interesting.
your eyes and etc. So in handwriting, for example, with a pen is a double it's a double learning. I mean, you learn the letters, but you also learn by actually moving your hand in handwriting. So that's another example of how I think that yes, we shall embrace the digital age, but we also need to be able to have a critical view on how education is formed and how learnings are transmitted.
It's so interesting. I like even when you're talking about exciting investment opportunity, you have the point of view of like the impact and the big impact. So let me get from there. I want to ask you, so when you're investing, do you see yourself mainly as an investor, maybe with something with also an impact, or you also see yourself as a mentor while you invest? Do you think it's
That's an easy question for me, at least, because
yes?
it's definitely both. I mean, I respect that there could be many styles of investments. So there are probably, several ways to Rome, as we say, at least in
Yeah.
the European languages. That is an expression. I don't know if it exists in English too, but there are many ways to Rome. You can invest in very many different ways. But the way I have enjoyed investing is to be able to be close to the company and to the management team and sort of walked away together with them and trying to be useful um, uh, because that's more fun. And for me, that works better and it yields better results. It gives you a much better understanding of the business, of the difficulties, when to sort of speed up and when to pull back. But it also gives you, I think, a relationship to, the entrepreneurial spirit of the company, which is, the fun of investment is that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. And so you had such this could have been your career up to now, but actually, all this thoughtfulness brought you to now more recently, right? Although it's quite a while by now to be involved in the world of media and publishing. And you spend a lot of your time working on defending freedom of the press and ensuring the financial support of independent media outlets. Can you start by telling us why is this work important to you?
I think there are many sources to that.
Yeah.
I did mention that both my parents were engaged with the Norwegian resistance movement during the Second World War. And when I grew up, that gave me an important sense of the basic human rights, which is sort of the fundamental of our society, and freedom of expression and speech in particular. So that has also always been with me. And then, I guess a little bit by coincidence, I came across one of the clients in my wealth management business. He was also the heir of Schibsted, which was a large Norwegian media company, paper-based, I should say, in the 90s. So I helped him introduce the company at the Norwegian Stock Exchange and eventually sort of joined the board, became chair and stayed chair for more than 20 years and learned the business. And it was interesting because when he asked me whether I would join the board and even to become the chair, I said, no, I can't do that. I don't know anything about media business. How can you ask me? um, and he basically said, I trust you. And that was an important sort of talking about mentors, and that became him. That you said, okay, I'll give it a try. And one of the advantages of the digital sort of age in media was that I didn't know anything about the press. So I came in with an entrepreneurial mind, and tried to look at the business and see what it needed. Stayed close to the clients, and it was obvious that the digital way of disseminating information was much more efficient and powerful than through press or through printed press. Not that we don't need both, and I still enjoy reading a newspaper, printed newspaper, but it was a better mousetrap, and to be able to then be part of that was a terrific experience for me. That I got all in, and I'm still there. And I think that if you sort of fast forward today, I'm deeply worried about access to reliable information in our society, and that's I think if we lose that access to reliable information on which we can base our decisions, that could lead to the further polarization that I mentioned, and I think slide us into totalitarianism. We have enough examples both in Italy and Europe
Yes.
to know about that and the dangers of that.
So that actually, I wanted to ask you a bit more about that because it's very interesting. Because one, as you were saying, is also there are some outlets more reliable than others, but then all media outlets are gonna rely more on AI. So
Mm-hmm.
is that gonna make everybody? Are you concerned about even the ones that try to be reliable with the use of AI and all the disinformation and it outside could become more unreliable. I mean, where are we going about with this?
I wish I knew.
I know.
um, um, I think you have to start, at least I start with the realization that AI is here to stay. I mean, it's a little bit like when we got social media 10 years ago or 12, 15 years ago. It's something about accepting reality. And I think that AI is here to stay. So then it's more sort of how do we navigate the new landscape? And my current view is that the media market will end up with a few quality brands that
Mhm.
will survive, but that most likely not be as accessible to a larger audience as we know it today, because there will be paywalls. On the other side, we will have AI fueled services that would give you a general knowledge about the news and what is happening in the world, dominated by a few tech companies. And those will be sort of what I call free, which is then, the expression of a barter with all your private information and digital user habits. So it's not sort of a world that I look upon with great enthusiasm. So I think for the media companies, you need to navigate this and to see what are your strengths and how can you build a sustainable business given this new landscape. There is no, I think, easy lunch. It hasn't been for a long time in media, but now you have to do a lot of hard work. What I'm particularly worried about is the local and regional press. because the level of investment to really participate in artificial and how you should make use of artificial are high, and the resources for local and media press, particularly in the U.S., but also now starting in Europe, is meager. You're struggling to survive even in this kind of business atmosphere. As you hear, I'm worried.
Yes, so these are big questions, and I want to come back to that. And there's a few questions, but I wanted to ask you before because it's so interesting. If you could describe a little bit, because you kind of alluded to the overall business model of Schibsted, the majority shareholder, the Tinius Trust, and the Scots Trust that owns the Guardian's media group. I mean, how does all these? Because you're in the middle of all these, which is so interesting.
Yeah. I think that both Schibsted and the Guardian have had they are not the same. I mean, I have to sort of talk about them as two different things, because Schibsted is operating in the Scandinavian markets. They are relatively small, at least with the numbers that they're used to in the US, but they have strong brands. They are digital advanced. The readers are well off, so the propensity to pay is still high. So that would work in smaller markets where there is still a need to see the news with sort of local or regional eyes. Now, the Guardian, of course, is a global brand, so there, the business model that we have adopted is different. It's a little bit like you could read it for free. There's no paywalls. However, dear reader, you know that quality journalism is not for free. It doesn't sort of rain from the sky. I mean, it requires a lot of hard work by the journalists. So if you would like to read this in the future, you should pay. And here are some options. And the advantage with that, it has turned out, is very controversial when you first launched it about 6-7 years ago. But it built sort of a two-way relationship with the reader. The readership is not sort of based on a business transaction. There's a paywall, you pay, you get the stuff. But it's much more of a mutual loyalty. In a way, you can say that to take a different tack on this, there's a general trend in society that there is a loss of belonging, right? But we would like to be part of the herd, right?
Yeah.
So we would like to be, we would like to feel part of a community, but if you're part of a community, there is mutual loyalties, because you would like your community to persist and to flourish, and that's a little bit sort of what we have been able to build in the Guardian now. So we have 1.3 million contributing readers. And that's really the backbone of the income.
So that's interesting, because there was a question here from the beginning that said, what can individuals and institutions do to ensure that quality journalism survives in the near future? So you think it is we all should contribute?
I think it's a joint responsibility. Now, I should say, you talked about trust and trust business, and I forgot to sort of comment on both Schibsted now. It wasn't that before, because Schibsted used to be a listed company. But both Schibsted and The Guardian are owned by trusts.
Mm-hmm.
And the advantage of that is that a trust is there for perpetuity. The trust is there because it has a particular purpose. The Guardian, for instance, is to ensure that the Guardian retains its financial and editorial independence in perpetuity. So there is not an owner that will sort of pocket the money and go and spend it on a yacht or a private jet, right? If there is a surplus, it will go back and produce journalism. So if we can get this work, it's a sort of self-perpetuating mechanism, and I think and that kind of ownership, which is long-term and willing to invest in a business that doesn't you don't invest in journalism today because you're going to get rich, at least for most. Maybe there are niches, but I mean, you invest in it because you believe that this is important for society. So I think that said, I think it's also easier to contribute. Because you're not contributing to somebody's pockets, you're contributing to more journalism.
That's a great point. You are absolutely right about that, right? That's the entire role of a not-for-profit. I just want to say this is, to me, so interesting because what you're pointing out is like how we always focus on corporate governance from the point of view of the company, the ownership working well. But what you're pointing out is how the corporate governance matters, even if I'm trying to think in terms of independence of the media, how we should be
Totally.
thoughtful about these things. Now, let me ask you, like going back to the money, sorry, but you were saying like the financial independence is very important in the end for
Absolutely.
For the thought independence. So, what are the main revenue streams for how do the books balance? How do you see you're at this you see this media business, right? And we kind of guess, but we don't know. How does it all work?
You suppose that it actually works? Is that what you say?
I am hoping that at least you know how it should work.
Well, I think that we should be aware of the fact that there are very few, at least, pure news providers that is making a lot of money. I mean, New York Times does, and a few other specialists do. But in general, the financial sustainability in most press organizations that really have, a true editorial department and that has an editorial code that is for society, I think most of them will have difficulties on their own. But the two sources of income, it has not really changed over time. It's advertising on one side, and then subscriptions or reader or viewer or listeners' contributions. So it is some form of contributions from the readers. What has changed is the importance. Because if you go back, let's say 10, 15 years ago, advertising was, at least 2/3, maybe more, maybe up to 90% of the income. And reader contributions were small, important, but small. And now it's reversed. And that is because the big techs, they have been very clever in building advertising businesses, and they have sucked up a lot of the growth in the advertising business. So they will be sort of the main players for consumer-based advertising today. And a lot of media companies have become dependent on the Googles and the Facebook of this world. So that they will derive a lot of the advertising income through Google, not directly to the advertising intermediaries. And that is also what is dangerous with the move to AI, Because what Google is doing today is, of course, referring, when you look up something in Google, let's say what is happening in Europe or what is happening in Italy, Google will refer you to an Italian publication or to, for me, a Norwegian publication, and I can read the news there. But with an AI, they wouldn't do that. You can see it already in Google today. If you look up something, they will give you an article. So not only sort of a reference, but the full article. So you won't move from Google to the news source or the original news source. You will stay at, within Google. And then you don't get the traffic, and then you don't get the advertising revenue. So I think that all referred traffic from the big aggregators will further decline. And the click-through rate we see today is much lower than it is in sort of the search environment that we knew. So I think that reader revenue will become even more important in the future.
That's very interesting. I never heard about this, but I can see why would that happen in that way. There's a question here. It says, what is your view on Wikipedia or similar sources? Does a public maintained system offer truth and possibly less bias inside or knowledge sharing?
Oh, that's a big question also, I can tell you. We will need at least a couple of more hours, Francesca. But the difficulty with I always call it a public utility because that's what it is in my view, like Wikipedia, is that they are dependent on information supplied by readers or volunteers, etc. And of course, it's cross-checked, etc. But in the world of dis and misinformation that we live in, it's so much more easy to distort the sources. And that is, I know, a difficulty for Wikipedia and others. And there's another sort of difficulty, and that is that all the AI players will, of course, scrape whatever information that is available on public sources, also Wikipedia. And that means that their information that in earlier days was proprietary, at least it was definitely owned by Wikipedia, is now used by anybody that would like to feed their language models with new information. And it's a little bit the same with, of course, the public press. I mean, they have been scraping information from public press all along, regardless of the intellectual property rights, etc. So they have seen that as being publicly accessible, and thus a public that it's a public good. So they can use it freely without paying for it. And so I do think that still public services are better than what you find in the chat GTP or other search or LLMs, but you just have to be careful when you search for information, regardless of the source. And I will even include the newspapers, but of course, if there is an editorial process behind it, it is much more reliable than any other source.
This is so interesting. I do wish we had a couple other there's a few more questions, but let me ask you one more. I just wanted to go one moment back to the issue about how the trust keep independence, right? But both Schibsted and The Guardian are European media. Do you think this model could be replicated in other places like the US, for example, or is it really works only in Europe?
Well, you have a lot of trust in the US also today, and you also have, a lot of at least smaller and more regional press. either being funded by philanthropic money from trusts or even being owned by trusts. So I think that the trust ownership is something in between state-to-state controlled ownership and private ownership. The advantage of a trust is, of course, the long-term view. And often when you are developing something like a new service, change will take time, and you risk losing money for a period of time. And I think that in a publicly listed company, the patience for waiting for the return is more limited. So having players that could tolerate more risk and yet also tolerate a lower return and look at it for the long term, and because they're also part of their purpose is public good. I think that's a very good way of organizing some businesses. Yes.
So do you think ultimately we might converge to all that, and because people will trust more if they know that it's owned by a trust, or you think it's not possible?
Definitely. At the same time, my ambition, and I think coming from the business side, my ambition is that media shall be profitable, or at least economically sustainable in the sense that we know it in a private company. It's just that I recognize that the current climate investment that we have and the way money flows in a publicly listed company or even in private equity, it's so sort of focused on return that it's difficult, I think, to find the money for some services that we still need.
There's another question on this, and I apologize. There's so many questions, I won't be able to get them all. But it says, is there any independent source that reliably rates or establishes a level of truthfulness with any source of news or knowledge? What can individual consumers use to help gauge what sources they can trust? Maybe not.
I don't think that there is one single source that is that I can refer to. These people are telling the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth kind of thing, because telling the truth is difficult. I mean, finding what is actually reliable as information is very difficult in today's society. If you knew how much fact checking that is going on in a well-run editorial room, you will be amazed. And it's down to you receive a photography. This is a true or a false photography. How can you tell whether it could be sort of from Gaza, from the Ukrainian war, or from a shooting in America, any kind of use? How do you know that is actually true, or is it fake? And how shall you sort of find that out so that you can publish it and people can rely on what they see in the photo? So you have to be very diligent in doing that, and sometimes you will make mistakes. I mean, you will publish something that is not correct, but just to give me an example, you go down to, this is said to be taken at a certain point in time. If you go to and see, how are the shadow falling in the picture, and is that shadow commensurate with the time of the day that this photo is supposed to be taken? You go back and see, is this an accurate photo of this building And then you go back and you access photos that are from similar building, for the same building from similar time periods. I mean, it's an enormous sort of fact-finding work that's going on. So it's at least a newspaper that is well run is more keen to try to reach reliable information than many other sources that you will find on the open web.
It's so interesting. And I see we are almost at the end. Let me ask you just one
Okay.
question about Kellogg, given that, we are also celebrating the fact that you're a Kellogg alum. As you
I'm
mentioned,
proud of being that. Yeah.
thank you, thank you. That's what I love to hear. Now, it's like right now our the percentage of our students is 37% in our 2-year MBA
hmm
and larger in the 1-year MBA international. I'm sure it was much lower when you were there. What were your experience like as an international student? How did you connect with other students when you were here at Kellogg with your incredibly varied international experience and background?
Well, it was very easy. I mean, I think yeah, but not, let, do you understand me correctly? I found it a very welcoming atmosphere and very open. So it was easy to come. I think that's one of the advantages of and praise that I can say to Americans. I mean, they're very hospitable in all different sense. I can I can tell you that I had also the advantage that I spoke Spanish, and we had a large group from Mexico, and
Yes.
they adopted me. I don't know if it was a mascot or just out of pity, but so I was absorbed. I played soccer with them. We went out drinking. We had a lot of good times. So that was a particularly for me happy experience.
Well, that's fantastic to hear, and I really hope we can get you here to talk to the student, on our campus soon. But oh, Jacob, this is so amazing. That's why I love this conversation. So you've been so thoughtful and thinking. You made me think of so many things, and I hope everybody who's been listening and who will listen continuing, because this will stay on our website, will have enjoyed that and make us reflect. You are
hmm
playing such an important role, and we are so proud to call you a Kellogg alum. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
And
Pleasure to be here.
thank
Pleasure to be
you.
here. Thank you very much.
Bye to everybody.
Bye bye.